Okay. Hello, Epidemics. I hope everybody's doing well today. Our announcements, nothing new. We've got a quiz and a journal entry, both due Sunday, April 3rd before midnight. And your project will be due before midnight on Sunday, May 1st. So you have about a month left on your projects. Presentations are going to be on April 26th and April 28th. So I want to, before we get into talking about the Black Death, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about COVID. Lots of places are lifting mask mandates right now. I saw that North Shore is going to be lifting their mandate on April 11th. And with the information that I've been following from epidemiologists and doctors, I'm not real happy about lifting mask mandates. COVID is a very dangerous disease. In the short run, for people who are young and relatively healthy and vaccinated especially, it might just be a cold, not a big deal. But even young, healthy, vaccinated people are developing long COVID. So you guys heard of long COVID?
Yes, no. And I think I have it.
Yes.
Yes. So it's a longer term chronic condition that causes extreme fatigue, causes brain fog, difficulty concentrating, a lot of these vague kind of symptoms, but they can be severe enough that they can cause you to be disabled, completely unable to go to work, unable to go to school. So that is a serious concern. We're also seeing increased risk of various other diseases after COVID, even mild COVID, for we don't know how long. There is an increased risk of heart disease, heart attacks, strokes, and the latest thing I saw was it also increases your risk of developing diabetes, regardless of your weight. So I strongly, yes, blood clots. COVID causes blood clots, and where those clots form will, that can cause problems in any part of the body because you don't know where those clots can form. So I strongly recommend you guys continue to mask when you're in public. If you're outside and you're vaccinated, you can take your mask off. I go for walks. I don't wear a mask when I go for walks, but if I'm indoors, I'm wearing a mask. And we're seeing the next surge coming along. So I'm not eating in restaurants. I do go out to restaurants when we're kind of in a lull between these surges, but we've got another surge coming. So I've quit that. Takeout or outside only at this point.
Wow.
Does anybody have any questions? You guys are better educated about this than a lot of people. All right. Then let's move on with our Black Death? Hang on just this. Oh, yeah. Okay, there we go. All right. So last time we were talking about what people thought was going on with the Black Death and with disease in general. And there was the idea that the Black Death was related to an imbalance of humors. So remember the humors, blood, phlegm, what was it? Green bile and yellow bile, black bile. And they all had characteristics that were associated with them. And specific diseases would be assigned specific imbalances. So plague was considered to be an excess of blood. You had too much blood. So the treatment was, of course, bloodletting. They also used emetics, things to make you vomit, purgatives, things to make you have a little bit of diarrhea there, to get out excess wet. They added heat and blankets to encourage sweating. So this is another idea that has persisted into modern times. Hot yoga, anybody? You get hot, you sweat, you get out toxins, right? Except of course, that's an idea from the 1300s and it's not accurate.
Don't saunas do that too? Or aren't they like?
Some people think saunas also cause you to sweat and sweat out toxins. You're not really getting rid of toxins. And anybody who uses that term toxins and can't define it for you, generally what saunas are really good for is relaxing muscles and increasing blood flow. So they can be useful, especially if you've had an injury and you're trying to heal, to get that blood flowing to that part of the body. Plus, you know, in winter, they feel good. They would also burst the buboes to let out excess humor. Now, you'll notice that a lot of these treatments are trying to get liquid out of the body. It's not just blood, even though they say it's an excess of blood. They're trying to get liquids out of the body. The pus from the buboes, vomiting and diarrhea, to clean out, to get stuff out of the digestive tract. What do you think all these treatments really do? They dehydrate you. They dehydrate the patient, which is not good for the patient. Bloodletting in the 1300s increased risk of infection. Bacterial infections could get into the body through bloodletting. Remember, there weren't any antibiotics back then. These things could be lethal. So, not surprisingly, none of these treatments really helped against the Black Death. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the humors part of it. So take a screenshot so we can start talking about miasma. So miasma literally means bad air. And it's an ancient term. It goes back, I can't remember if it goes all the way back to the Greeks, but it definitely goes back to the Romans. And it's the idea that stuff in the air causes disease. Okay. Stuff is kind of a vague term. But remember, they didn't have germ theory yet. They didn't have good microscopes. They couldn't see bacteria. This kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because there are a lot of diseases that are contagious through the air. We're going to talk a lot about miasma when we talk about malaria, because it really started coming about because this concept really came about because of malaria. It was originally related to malaria. And if you think about it, malaria is spread by mosquitoes. And mosquitoes tend to be in places near standing water. And we can smell standing water. It has an odor, especially if it's kind of stagnant. So people would smell the water, and this area would have a lot of malaria. And so they said it was caused by the bad air. Okay, so like I said, we're going to discuss that more when we talk about malaria, but since it was one of the theories of disease at the time, I thought it would be important to bring up now. So when we're talking about dealing with the plague, regardless of the cause, we talked about treatments related to the idea that it was an imbalance of the blood, too much blood. But there were other treatments as well. There was a solution called the Theriac famous panacea. A panacea literally means cure all. It cures everything. And this was made of opium, cinnamon, herbs, honey, and the flesh of a snake. And it was all ground up together in a liquid form, and it was fermented. I don't know about you guys, but I look at this list and I'm like, okay, cinnamon, herbs, and honey, that's okay, but flesh of a snake and opium? I don't want to be consuming, well, okay, I have eaten snake before, but I don't really want to be consuming opium. And I don't think eating the flesh of a snake is going to cure anything. It was hard to make, and so it was rare and expensive. So this is what the upper class wealthy people tended to take. And just like the bloodletting, just like the purgatives and causing people to sweat, none of these treatments really did much.
At least they were high though. I'm sure they felt better after the opium.
Yeah, I'm sure they felt good after the opium. Is it available from the stomach? I know people used to smoke opium. I don't know if it gets into the bloodstream from the digestive tract or not. That's a good question. Certainly smoking opium, they won't care. Okay, so, oh shit. Sorry. My notes were a little disorganized here. So the treatments didn't change the fatality rate, did not reduce suffering, did not prolong life. Let me make a note. I need to reorganize these for the next time I teach this. All right. I don't know that you really need to screenshot any of this. I'm not going to ask you the ingredients of the treatment, but the treatments didn't work. So I'm sorry about this. My notes jumped around a bit. There's a little bit more I have here on miasma. So the response based on the miasma theory. What would you do if you thought you had bad air that was making you sick?
Move or open windows, increase the airflow possibly.
Yeah, that's what I do. Open the windows, make sure I have good filters in my air heating and air conditioning system. So people would flee areas of bad air. But instead of opening windows, they would shut doors and windows and hang heavy drapes. And they had a lot of wall hangings and tapestries on the walls to block airflow. And again, some of this makes sense. Remember, mosquitoes were a big problem and a carrier of malaria. How do mosquitoes get in the house? Through open windows. They had no screens for windows. Now, because of this idea of bad air, there were some good things that helped, that happened. They cleaned city streets and they moved malodorous trades out of the city. What is malodorous? Anyone know? Nope.
I'm guessing the bad air.
Yeah, bad smells. Mal refers to bad, odor, smells. It's right there in the name. So this would be things like leather work and butchers. So that was good. And then there was the not so good stuff. So they used aromatic agents. What do we mean by aromatic agents? We mean bonfires. We mean gunpowder by firing cannons. Cannons was a new technology back then. We had gunpowder back in the 1300s. Can you believe that? I did not know it was that old of a technology until I started researching this. And people would carry vials of aromatic spices or bouquets of flowers. Later on, after tobacco was brought back from the New World, smoking tobacco was thought to help prevent the plague. not exactly a good idea. And our good friend here, the plague doctor, this mask that had this beak, that beak was stuffed with herbs and various scented things to try and clean the air that the doctors were breathing in. Even though they didn't have a good germ theory, I mean, if we look at our plague doctor friend here, he had a mask to help reduce air coming in. Well, that might help a little bit for airborne diseases. Goggles over the eyes, covered with this big coat. This coat would be covered with wax, so it would be water repellent. All of this kind of stuff certainly helped reduce the disease. They didn't tend to wear gloves, however. So that was a big, big miss for them. Okay, so screenshot this. Now, there were other theories of the origin of plague that were not even vaguely scientific. There were religious theories about the cause of the plague. These are not scientific theories. These are theories in layman's terms. Plague was seen as a punishment from God. It was caused by the moral failings of society. So what do? We need to placate the divine wrath. We need to make God happy with us again. So we cast out or punish people with poor morals, the people who clearly brought this on. So what kinds of sins are we talking about? What do you think we're talking about?
Stealing, for sure.
Stealing, okay.
That
Cheating?
gosh darn premarital sex.
Premarital sex was a big one, yes.
Cheating?
Cheating. How about abuse of food or drink? Drinking too much or eating too much? Excess sleep or idleness? Premarital sex, yep. But also other types of sex that were considered unnatural, which was probably code for homosexuality.
Wouldn't sodomy just be a good blanket term for that?
Yes. Blasphemous religious practices. Oh, this was a good one. So who would be the wrong religion? We're going to get to this in just a second, but this was an excuse to go after the Jews. And of course, women. So during this time period in England, there were women who would dress as men and go to tournaments. Tournaments were events that were for the men, right? And this is the kind of thing like jousting or various displays of fighting prowess. And the women would dress up like men, and they would go and they would compete and they would watch the tournaments. Of course, this is inappropriate. That's just no good for women. Women should not be wearing pants and should definitely not be riding horses with one leg on each side. If you're going to ride a horse, you got to sit side saddle, right? Yeah. Yeah, Jerry, I see that expression. I'm right there with you. So how do you deal with these sinners?
Isolate them.
Yeah, kick them out of your society, banish them. Cutting off hands, burning at the stake, stoning to death. And we can also add foreigners were suspect. Oh yeah, Julia, you're exactly right. Women still have to face scrutiny for how we dress. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's still an issue. You would think that after 700 years after this time period, we would have gotten over some of these things, but we clearly haven't. A lot of these things are still issues. Witches, which were women who practiced what passed for medicine at the time. And beggars. If you were poor and you begged on the streets to get food or money to buy food, you were the problem.
Weren't witches just women who could like do anything other than
Yeah,
just sit at home and cook?
yeah. Witches has been used against women for no good reason throughout history. Sometimes it was just somebody powerful didn't like that particular woman.
Yeah.
So they would accuse them of being a witch. Yep, absolutely. Okay, and the poor people, we blame the poor. That kind of stuff still goes on to some degree today. Foreigners, we still blame foreigners for things. People still blame Jews for stuff that has nothing to do with their religion. So a lot of this stuff has not changed in 600 or 700 years. All right, so I'd like you guys to take a screenshot here. This engraving is an engraving of burning the Jews to try and end the plague. So anti-Semitism was rampant. And the idea was, the rumor was, the Jews were poisoning wells and causing the plague. Or they had killed Jesus, who, if you actually read your Bible, was Jewish. You couldn't be a Christian until after Jesus. There weren't any Christians until Jesus. So, yeah. They were conspiring against Christians. An interesting tidbit here, the Jewish religion requires better hygiene. So Jewish people were less likely to get the plague because they cleaned themselves and their clothes more frequently than non-Jewish people. So Jews were often tortured, encouraged to convert to Christianity, and if they didn't convert, they would be killed. Plague was an excuse. Okay, screenshot this. So there were also groups of people who were trying to appease God so that the plague would disappear, and they formed piety cults, which means they practiced penance and self-abasement. Self-abasement is self-harm with the idea of pleasing God. And so you can see them here. These guys have these multi-stranded whips. These are cat o' nine tails. And they would beat themselves with those as a way to try and appease God. Look, I'm punishing myself for the sins of society. You don't have to punish us with the plague. They would go on processions to holy shrines, walking for 40 days, because 40 days is a magical number in the Bible. Some would carry crosses. They would also practice asceticism, which is denial of pleasure, especially pleasurable food and drink. And they would avoid women because, you know, women are evil.
Duh.
All right, who said that? You just failed the class. Okay. Now, not surprisingly, sometimes the piety cults would try and cause harm to others, especially Jews, by beating them with cat o' nine tails and not allowing them pleasurable food and drink and making them carry crosses down the street and that kind of stuff. There was a lot of praying to saints, confessions. In Venice, Italy, the people of Venice prayed to the Virgin Mary that they were going to build, if she lifted the plague, they would build a massive shrine to her. This was in 1681, so it was a little after the Black Death. And they promised yearly processions to this shrine church. The plague declined, and these processions continue to this day. And I mixed my slide up because that big towering church in the previous slide was the church that they built in 1681 to the Virgin Mary to end the plague. Okay, so good time for a screenshot. Then there was the "we're all going to die anyway" crowd. So there were people who were like, we're doomed. There's nothing we can do about the plague. And so they binged. And they binged on eating, on drinking, on sex. They would just go from one tavern to another. It was an excuse to get drunk, to eat a lot of food, and to have a lot of sex. And there was the school of thought that the plague was a demonic curse. So instead of God sending it, it was sent by a demon. And people who believed this kind of did the same stuff as those who thought it was God's wrath. So apparently, the things that please God will also drive out demons. And they would drive, when they were trying to drive out the demons, they would drive out or kill anyone who was bringing the curse. So obviously, sick people, you could say, were bringing the curse. But once again, who else is bringing the curse? Jewish people, women, homosexuals, sodomites, drunkards, beggars, foreigners. The usual crowd, also known as everybody except white men. Then there were the things that were called, that we call superstitions. The stars were out of alignment. We still hear people say this kind of stuff today. Oh my God, the stars are out of alignment. I'm having a bad day. And these superstitions also suggested things like certain metals and precious stones could offer protection. Precious stones, modern day, we call these crystals. The number 4 is considered special. And so we have 4 humors, 4 seasons, 4 directions, north, south, east, west. So lots of magical thinking going on. But when you put it in the context of the time, they had no idea what was actually causing the plague. They had no idea what could be done about it. And they were seeing huge numbers of people getting sick and dying of this disease. Okay. I'm gonna kind of shift to some of the other things that happened as a result of the plague here. Moving away from why the plague was occurring and how to deal with the plague. And I'm going to talk about some of the changes to society. And the first thing that happened was flight from cities to countryside. This actually was somewhat protective because plague requires a certain population density. And if you're living at lower population density, you're less likely to get exposed to the plague. In fact, you're less likely to get a lot of different diseases. And this flight from the cities to the countryside, of course, the wealthy were more able to do this. Doctors fled the cities, and family would abandon each other. So I'm going to read you a quote from Giovanni Boccaccio in a book called The Decameron, or a text called the Decameron. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbors was scarce found any that showed fellow feeling for another, how kinfolk held aloft and never met, or but rarely. Enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women that in the horror thereof, brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to believe, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been strangers. Wherefore the sick of both sexes, whose numbers could not be estimated, were left without resource, but in the charity of friends, and few such there were, or the interest of servants, who were hardly to be had at high rates and on unseemly terms. Thoughts on that one?
There wasn't any like, they didn't have police forces and things then, so people weren't held accountable. So it was easy to disregard things, easier than now, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you left it's hard to find somebody. Did they even have a mail system then? I can walk 1 mile away and you're never gonna find me back in those days,
Just about. That's just about true. Yeah. Especially if everybody in a household fled and they went different places. No phones. There were
They
some.
had pictures.
Yeah, no pictures. Yeah, you couldn't put up a flyer saying I'm looking for so-and-so. Yeah, people could literally just lose track of each other and never see each other again. Absolutely. Okay.
Is there any way you could go back to that or no?
The previous one?
Yeah.
I took my notes down. Did you need those?
Yeah. It's okay though if you can't write them all.
It's recorded, so.
Yeah, it is recorded.
Okay.
There wasn't much on the screen, was there? Flight from cities to countryside. Including
It's
doctors.
okay. You don't have to do it all. Thank
Okay.
you though.
You're welcome. Funeral practices also had to change during this time period. Graveyards literally filled up. And victims would be buried in mass graves. One of the best ways we know to find out if plague moved through an area is to find mass graves. If we have mass graves that date back to the time period of the plague, then we know the plague came through that area. So priests would lead processions to the graveyard. And he would start with one or two. Julia, go ahead.
So I've been meaning to ask this ever since we started the Black Plague, but I keep forgetting. Is it true that the nursery rhyme "Ring a Ring a Rosie" have you ever heard that like that's referring to the Plague?
I have heard that that's referring to the plague, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you knew if that was like certain.
I don't know for sure that that's accurate. Pocket full of posies. Posies are like small flower arrangements.
Yeah, I
for
heard
days.
it was to like the smell of the
Yeah,
body being burnt.
yeah, it would kind of make sense, but I've also heard that it referred to smallpox.
Oh, okay.
Because ring around the rosy, that sounds more like rosy swellings of smallpox rather than, the black bruise like appearance of plague.
Yeah.
But I
Sorry,
don't.
that was random.
No, that's fine. Not a problem. Okay, so the priest would start with 1 or 2 deceased, and then other people would kind of join the procession. With their deceased loved ones, hoping they could be buried in the same grave. And of course, traditional funerary practices had to change. We talked about this with Ebola. Instead of bathing the body, people would just kind of wrap it up in a shroud or stuff it in a box or something to get it out of the house as fast as possible. There would not be a large number of people at the funerals because everybody would just go do a quick burial, get that body in the ground so that it wasn't capable of spreading the disease, because they knew that they could get the body they could get the disease from a dead body. And these really quick burials caused a fear of being buried alive. And I'm sure some people were buried alive during this time period. Before the plague, bodies were laid out until they started to decay. Got to make sure they're dead. Once they start to decay, you know they're dead. You could bury them. And there was a lot of fear for souls because many of these people could not get last rites. There weren't enough priests around. There were too many people dying. That's a huge problem. Okay, so less handling of the bodies, quicker burials, mass graves because there just wasn't enough space. All of these were major changes to how funerals were done. So screenshot time.
Didn't they used to put like a bell on bodies?
The bell was on the plague doctors.
Oh, okay.
No, wait. Bells were on the lepers.
Oh, okay.
They belled the lepers.
Oh, okay.
Which is a whole nother little story because leprosy is not very contagious, even though everybody was like, we don't want to touch the lepers because we don't want to get their disease. Okay. The plague caused a decline in the population in Europe. What can happen when you have depopulation? You have fewer workers. If you have fewer workers, you have to pay more money to get people to work. Hopefully, we're seeing this in the US right now. We're seeing a lot of people, a lot of companies saying they can't find enough workers. And it's like, well, how much are you paying? Hold out for more money, folks, if you can. Landowners began to accept labor instead of money from tenant farmers. So it used to be that if you couldn't afford to own your own land, you could rent farms from landowners, and they wanted cash. And during this time period, because there were fewer people to farm, landowners began to say, okay, you work in the fields, I'm not going to charge you for that, but I get some of the crops. I get some of the food, which they'd been taking before as well, but now they just quit charging for cash. Okay. So remember, the Black Death was around 1346, and it only lasted a few years. But the second plague pandemic lasted until the late 18th century. Different sources have different exact dates, especially the end dates, but we're not too worried about it. After the year of annihilation, the couple of years of the Black Death, there were still recurring outbreaks, but not wide. It was not as widespread as those first few years. This kind of makes sense. If you survived the Black Death in the 1350s, 1340s, you might have genetic characteristics that made you less vulnerable to this disease that you then pass on to your kids, which means they're less vulnerable to these diseases. So we still see cases coming through. Now, we're using the same strain of Yersinia pestis. So the same bacteria is still around, but cases become less severe and less frequent over time. And it became the case where most outbreaks began with trade from the Near East or the Middle East, what we call the Middle East. So even though cases were declining in this area as well, it was a little more established in this part of the world. And then it would spread out from kind of this core area into various parts of Europe over the next few centuries. Okay, so this is a good place for a screenshot. We're going to kind of move forward in time a little bit here, past the Black Death, but to later points in the second plague pandemic. Nate, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had it for a little bit.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Now, when you talk about, yeah, I see that, Jer. When you see that cases become less severe, that's virulence, right? That would be the term.
Virulence would be the
Or
term.
less, yeah.
In this case, it's genetic resistance in people.
Okay.
So we evolved to be less susceptible to plague.
From previous infection. Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So is this the right slide? Okay. All right. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, which would be the 1600s and 1700s. So after the Black Death, but while there were still these regular outbreaks going on, we start seeing the origin of public health as a concept and as things that are actually being done, as activities and responses to the plague. So there would be plague regulations. Things like movement of people, selling of clothes and bedding, that sort of stuff started being more regulated. And at this time period, there were strong legal and judicial powers to the people who were in charge of this, who were called health magistrates. Magistrates, of course, meaning a cop. So this was the health police force. And they could require people to quarantine, for example. They could require ships traveling to the area from somewhere else to quarantine. Remember, Pasteur would not show that germs cause disease until the 1860s. So we still didn't know that germs cause disease, but we knew that sick people and dead bodies could transmit plague to healthy people. We could figure out that selling your clothes and the bedding of people who died of the plague could transmit the plague to other people. We figured those things out without understanding germs. Okay, quick screenshot. So we are going to talk about Italy in the 1600s. Remember, I told you we've got little pieces of the story from various places, mostly from Italy and England. So here we are in Italy in the 1600s. Many outbreaks began in ports. Ships would come in, they would bring people who were sick, they would bring rats, they would bring rat fleas, and that could bring the plague to a city. So the Office of Health in Venice came up with a plan to protect the city from plague arriving on ships. And they created these structures called lazarettos. This is a lazaretto from the 1600s. It's at least partially still standing today. Lazarettos were quarantine facilities on islands. It worked great in Venice. There are a lot of islands there. And ships arriving with trade would be impounded, rubbed, and fumigated. So we kind of had figured out cleaning the vessels, fumigating them, reduced the likelihood that plague would be coming in on those vessels. Fumigation's going to kill rats and their fleas, so that's definitely going to work. The crew and any passengers were quarantined as well, and they were quarantined under guard because they were not willing participants. And it cost money. The government spent money to house and feed them. So they were at least being housed and fed, and they were staying on a beautiful island in the Mediterranean during quarantine. The cargo, oops, I didn't click, would be laid out in the sun and again fumigated. Fumigation here basically means smoke. So they would blow smoke or cause smoke to drift over the cargo that was laid out, which again, it could kill the mice, the rats, the fleas. And these quarantines lasted for 40 days. Why did the quarantines last for 40 days?
You said it was a magical Bible number.
Yes, yes. 40 days is a number that appears in the Bible over and over and over again. Specifically, the phrase 40 days and nights. Prophets would go into the desert for 40 days and nights. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights once Noah had his ark built. It turns out that during the time that the Bible was written, 40 days and 40 nights was a phrase kind of like we say 24/7 nowadays. We don't literally mean 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We just mean that's a lot of time that people do something. And 40 days and 40 nights meant they were a really long time, but we're not sure how long. But the Italian word for 40 is quaranta.
Wow.
And that's where we get the word quarantine.
I'm surprised I never picked up on that. Jeez.
You speak Italian?
I mean, it's close to Spanish. 40.
Yeah, that's true. So a lot of ships would try and avoid the quarantine. So Venice had to make a navy to force these ships into quarantine. So there was economic, administrative, and military support for the forced quarantines.
Sounds familiar.
Well, it'd be nice if we actually had that in this country. But instead we've apparently...
Didn't they have that in Italy though when it first started? They were forcing them folks.
Yes, they were. They were doing that in Italy at the beginning of this, yes. The US, of course, has decided that we're okay with, 1,000 people a day dying. So, by chance, incubation period of plague is less than 40 days. What does the incubation period mean?
It's the time. Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
No, go ahead, Nate. Go ahead, bro.
It's the time when the virus is, I don't want to say dormant, but it's the period of time where the symptoms are not prevalent, and I believe it coincides with the infectious period, or you are infectious during that period. But anyway, to summarize it, it's when you have the virus, but it hasn't shown any serious symptoms yet. Or not virus, but you know what I mean.
The disease.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's the time period from when you contract a disease to the time you show symptoms. So for plague, this works great because you are going to show symptoms in 40 days. And that's longer than the lifespan of an infected flea. So the fleas would not be able to survive for 40 days if they were infected. In addition to that, this whole process scattered the shipboard rats. Of course, rats can be infected. Their fleas then get it from the rats and give it to people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not a perfect system, but it worked to reduce outbreaks, and it worked pretty well as long as you could really keep these people quarantined for that period of time. Okay, screenshot. So that was in Venice. It worked well because a lot of the plague outbreaks were coming by ship. But what about on land?
They had wagons of food and goods
Yep,
with rats in them.
yep.
Great.
Okay, so this is a map of the Mediterranean, obviously. This is the Ottoman Empire in 1683. So this is our time period. There is Constantinople. Remember when we talked about the plague, the coming from Asia? Kaffa, I think, is right here on this little peninsula on the Black Sea. And then, of course, it would travel around the Mediterranean. So how do we do land-based quarantine? Well, many cities were walled. Times were much more violent, and you needed to protect the inhabitants of a city. So during outbreaks, you found out the city down the road had an outbreak. So you would have vigilante parties patrolling the walls. And the walls are designed to be walked on. They're wide walls. Military troops would form a perimeter around cities. So you were trying to keep people from coming in, even if they're bringing trade goods and food, because you don't want them bringing the plague. As countries developed, they would make national borders with troops. These are what were called sanitary cordons. Sanitary in this case means preventing disease from coming across. And the church decreed that if you snuck past one of these cordons, or you snuck into a walled city when it was in quarantine, you would be excommunicated, kicked out of the church.
A fate worse than death back then, arguably.
Some people at that time definitely believed it was a fate worse than death, because then your immortal soul was doomed to go to hell. You were not
Damned. Yeah.
damned. Yes. Literally damned.
Churches had a lot of mice then too, so that might have worked in your favor. All right. Oh, 3 minutes. Okay, I can get through this last little bit. So I want to give you an example of a sanitary cordon. The Austrian military created a border in the 1700s. Created. To try and keep the plague out. There was a force of 150,000 men, all male peasants, i.e. poor people and lower middle class, were conscripted. They were forced into the military. When an emergency was declared, nobody would be allowed in. Smugglers would then try and sneak people across the border. We call these refugees. Sounds familiar, right? People are fleeing bad conditions. If you were caught, you could be tried and sentenced on the spot. No second chances. Penalty was death by firing squad. Now, this Austrian sanitary cordon was very unpopular among the people of Austria. And it eventually ended due to internal pressure. I mean, you can imagine 150,000 men forced away from their homes, their families, their jobs. That's not going to be popular. All right. And we are once again out of time. Any last minute questions or comments? So we haven't got to the cure yet. I love this.
Yes, we have.
Have we?
We treat it nowadays with antibiotics.
No, I mean in your dialogue. I'm sorry.
Yep, we haven't gotten to the end yet.
This is my favorite subject so far, or topic in this class, because it's like the whole world could have died, man. Like,
Yes, absolutely. It certainly could.
Professor, I had a question. Sorry if I cut you short there, Jerry.
I'm good.
This is about the project. When do you want them submitted by? I'm assuming it's got to be before the presentation date, obviously.
Okay, so if you're writing a paper or turning something in, it's due May 1st.
Mine's a PowerPoint, just to clarify.
So if you're doing a presentation,
Yes,
all I need are your sources
sure.
and your crap checklists.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's a little worksheet that just
I remember. It's like a rubric.
similar to it. It's basically asking you to look at your source and say, Does it have ads? Is it a, kind of a list of things to help you determine if it's a good source?
I'll admit I use like one Wikipedia article, but I feel like it adds much needed context. I don't know if you, and I don't want to take up too much of your time with this. Just to give you a background, it's the opioid epidemic. So, and I don't know the criteria for slide length, but I kind of wanted to get like some good key info. I'm starting off with what are opioids? What is the poppy flower? How it was used in ancient history, then the medicinal purposes. And now I'm focusing on like its consequences, its addictive qualities, and then I'll move to like modern day, the problem we have and possible solutions.
Sounds good to me.
I'm interested. I can't wait to hear about this.
Oh, it's gonna be, I'm probably on a couple blacklists for looking up the manufacturing of opium, but it is what it is. So, all right, I gotta go, but take care, you guys.
All right, bye guys.
Bye,
Next
Nate.
week. Thanks, Professor.
Bye.